Nearly 2.5 centuries ago, in the fall of 1779, in the midst of our American Revolution, a tragic and bloody battle between American patriots and Indian and British warriors occurred on the as-yet settled northern Kentucky shores of the Ohio River. It was perhaps more of a slaughter than a battle considering the circumstances, but nevertheless. This event provided a tale of such fantastic courage and heroic survival that Theodore Roosevelt would reference it in his 4-volume book set, The Winning of the West, in 1889. I'm Cam Miller, and this is River City's History. Episode 1, Rogers' Defeat. Our story begins with Patrick Henry. Yes, that Patrick Henry, the give me liberty or give me death master orator and founding father, Patrick Henry, who was also the governor of Virginia. Now, being the governor of Virginia brought you friends in important places like New Orleans, and thanks to the Spanish government, who don't get as much credit as the French do for coming to the aid of America during the Revolution, New Orleans was where the Spaniards were secretly storing supplies for our heroes, the Patriots. Now you have to remember, the Americans were ill prepared for a revolution. They had nothing. No accumulated wealth, no accumulated ammunition, and without the aid of foreign governments, our battle for independence would have turned out much differently. So, in the late summer of 1776, Governor Henry contacts his friends in New Orleans, and they orchestrate a supply run on keelboats or flatboats from Fort Pitt, which would become Pittsburgh, down the Ohio River, down the Mississippi to New Orleans, and then back to Fort Pitt. A long mission. The mission was a success, and Fort Pitt was stocked with gunpowder, ammunition, and other supplies. But by early 1778, those supplies were dwindling, and Henry and the powers that be decided that another New Orleans supply run was in order. First, he needed to find a capable captain to lead the expedition, and he found one in Captain David Rogers. Rogers was an Irish-born, energetic public servant and a former major in the Virginia militia. Upon receiving this appointment, Rogers formed a company of nearly 40 men, mostly farmers and locals, near the Redstone, Pennsylvania settlement, with little to no military experience. Among those brave enough to volunteer for this dangerous mission through the untamed wilderness of the West was Robert Benham, whom was named the commissary of the crew, and Basil Brown, whose family founded Brownsville, Pennsylvania. Rogers had 2 large, partially covered flatboats constructed at Fort Pitt, and in June of 1778, he and the crew set off for New Orleans. After many, many days, the party arrived at the mouth of the Arkansas River, where Rogers camped at a Spanish fort. A witness at the Spanish fort named Douglas Baker would later recollect that Rogers' arrival was met with some pomp and circumstance, with a 13-gun salute and members of Rogers' party carrying a, quote, banner of the United States, being the first 13 stripes ever seen on that ground, unquote. It was here that he had learned that the supplies he sought had been moved to St. Louis, but that he would still have to travel all the way to New Orleans to acquire the proper paperwork before heading to St. Louis for the goods. So Rogers decided to leave his men at the fort and take 6 men by canoe with him to New Orleans, with Robert Benham and Basil Brown being among those 6. Now, once in New Orleans, Rogers met with Governor Galvez of Spanish Louisiana and Oliver Pollock, a successful New Orleans merchant and financier of the American Revolution, who is oft credited, interestingly enough, with coming up with the $ symbol. Rogers and his crew were warmly received, but proper paperwork had to be obtained through proper channels. Galvez had to go through his superiors in Madrid, and Rogers through his superiors, including General George Rogers Clark and General Hand. Rogers sent Robert Benham with dispatches to Kaskaskia, Illinois, and the Falls of the Ohio, which would later be known as Louisville. He would remain in the Falls until rejoining Rogers on the return trip. The I's had been dotted and the T's had been crossed, and by the end of 1778, Rogers and his men left New Orleans to connect once again with the majority of his crew back at the Spanish fort along the Arkansas River. The 6 men traveled 90 miles north, then carried their canoes through the wilderness to avoid the British garrisons at Manchac and Natchez, Mississippi. They traveled 60 miles by land to Opelousas, Louisiana, and then 120 miles to the Natchitoches, and then another 120 miles along the Red River, arriving there on February 1st, 1779. A pounding and continuing rain forced the men to stay put for 2 weeks, but eventually they were able to resume their trip and reconvened with the rest of the crew at the Arkansas Spanish fort. Finally, on August the 5th, 1779, they reached St. Louis, and Rogers met with Captain Eugene Poiré and merchant Joseph Francis Perot. Perot would join Rogers on the expedition return trip so that he could collect the $11,814 that was owed to him by the Virginia government for furnishing supplies to George Rogers Clark during the Illinois campaign. Days later, the crew arrived in Louisville, and Benham rejoined the group. While there, George Rogers Clark, who had made Louisville his headquarters, assigned Captain Abraham Chapline and 23 men from the Illinois Regiment to assist in escorting the crew back up the river to Fort Pitt. He also provided Rogers with another boat to not only help with supply stowage, but to carry 6 British soldier prisoners. The expedition grew to nearly 65 people. "130 miles up the Ohio River, near the mouth of the Licking, Simon Girty, British agents, and a group of Indian forces made up of Mingos, Delawares, Shawnees, and Wyandots were camped on the Kentucky side of the Ohio River. Girty, a former member of the U.S. military who a few years earlier was tried and acquitted of treason at Fort Pitt, had decided to join Britain and the Indians during the conflict. Girty's band included his brother George and Matthew Elliott, a Pittsburgh trader. Girty had sent a scouting party down the river and received word that 3 boats of Americans were headed up the river. It was then that Girty began to formulate an ambush plan. The plan called for a group of Indians to go across the Ohio on a canoe, and on Girty's signal row back across the river to the Kentucky side, onto the sandbar of what is now the shore of Dayton, Kentucky, so the Americans would see them, and hopefully lure them on shore where an ambush would ensue. Girty set the plan in motion and lay waiting in the woods. On the afternoon of October 4th, 1779, Captain Rogers and his crew reached the mouth of the Licking River. It had been a long trip, much longer than originally anticipated, full of hardships and delays, but they were now at the halfway point of the Ohio, and in a matter of days, they would be back in Fort Pitt with the requested supplies, or so they thought. About a mile plus ahead of the mouth of the Licking, Rogers noticed a canoe with 7 Indians crossing the river. He ordered his men to land on the shore of the Licking on what is now Newport. He assumed the small Indian party was off to raid Kentucky settlements and that he had a duty to stop them. He ordered a few men to stay with the boats and the rest into the woods and followed the Ohio River shoreline down to where the canoe was spotted landing, in present-day Dayton, Kentucky. Suddenly, over 150 Indian warriors and British agents appeared from the woods and attacked the stunned Americans, shrieking war whoops, with gunfire erupting and tomahawks brutally murdering the unsuspecting crew. Most were killed instantly. Others ran for their lives through the woods, some being caught and scalped on the spot. The Indians commandeered 2 boats. The 3rd boat made it offshore, heading back to Louisville. Captain Rogers was shot in the abdomen. Clinging to life, he managed to be placed among heavy foliage by John Knotts. who had no choice but to leave the dying captain. He covered the captain with brush and ran for safety into the woods. Captain Rogers' body was never found. The massacre lasted only a few minutes, but when it was over, 45 Americans were killed, 5 were taken prisoner, and 13 managed to escape. The Indians were able to confiscate 40 50-pound kegs of gunpowder, crates of bullets, 2 boxes of flintstock rifles, 40 bales of clothing, dozens of kegs of rum, and thousands of dollars of Spanish silver coins. The Indians took some loot to Chillicothe, their headquarters, and buried the rest to return for it later. One of the 5 prisoners was someone Gertie knew well, John Campbell. Campbell was an acquaintance of Simon's from the Fort Pitt days, and was actually one of the surveyors who laid out the town of Pittsburgh. Another prisoner was Joseph Perot, who was taken to Detroit by the Wyandottes. The Shawnees took 3 other prisoners, burning 2 of them at the stake and adopting the 3rd, Captain Abraham Chapline. Darkness was near, and Basil Brown, who would escape the initial carnage by running deep into the woods, crossed the Licking River where it was most shallow 3 miles down, close to what would be Frederick's Landing in Wilder today. Assuming he was now out of danger, he rested along the Licking shoreline in would-be Covington, Kentucky. Suddenly, 2 Indians, roughly 30 yards away, fired upon him. When he went to return fire, his arms rendered him useless. He had been shot in both arms. Brown managed to run north back towards the Ohio River, escaping the Indians before passing out from blood loss. Meanwhile, on the opposite side of the Licking, Robert Benham remained motionless. He had been shot through both legs, and by some miracle had been able to conceal himself in a fallen tree. Benham had no choice but to stay in the spot for 2 whole days, waiting for the Indians to leave the area. If he didn't perish from his wounds, he'd certainly die from starvation, he thought. When he figured he was all alone, he fired his rifle at a raccoon that he had hoped would become his much-needed dinner. The echo of the gunshot bounced off the hills of northern Kentucky and had barely faded away when he heard a muffled "hello there" in the distance. Benham quickly reloaded his rifle, fearing someone from the Indian party had returned. He waited some time before answering the call. Benham hollowed back. Brown, realizing that the call was coming from the other side of the river, slowly and painfully made his way back southward to the shallow river crossing, following the cries of Benham until he reached his expedition crewmate. The 2 survivors were in a unique situation. Benham unable to use his legs, and Brown unable to use his arms. They quickly realized that in order to survive in the wilderness, they needed each other's help. Benham used torn pieces of their clothes and slippery elm bark to dress their wounds, while Brown constructed makeshift crutches with sticks, fixing them to Benham's legs with cloth. Benham was a good shot, and he was able to kill all the wild turkey, raccoons, and squirrels in the area that frequented the river bottoms, while Brown would retrieve them, guiding them with his feet to Benham, who would make a fire. To procure water, Benham placed a folded hat between Brown's teeth, and Brown would then wade into the Licking River, dipping the hat into the water and carrying it back to Benham. The 2 men repeated these survival tactics for days, which turned into weeks. As the temperatures began to drop, the deeper into the fall season they got, they constructed a makeshift shelter. Brown would spend nearly all of the daylight hours sitting on the riverbank, hoping against hope that a boat would pass. 19 days later, Brown heard the whooping cough of someone on the river. He hurried to the shore, frantically waving and shouting. The people on the flatboat answered, but were afraid that Brown was being used as a decoy by the Indians, who would then ambush them the moment they rowed to the shore. Brown begged the party, and after some negotiating, they agreed to meet up the river at the sandbar, not far from where a few weeks earlier the massacre had taken place. There, Brown could walk out some distance and prove he was not in the company of the Indians. Once they met, and after some hesitation, the party sent 2 able-bodied men to go rescue Robert Benham, who was at the mouth of the Licking. Finally, they were saved. Robert Benham and Basil Brown were taken to Louisville, where they were reunited with the surviving few who had made it downriver in boat number 3. The 2 were properly treated and retold their tales of adventure and survival in the northern Kentucky wilderness. Basil Brown would return to the Redstone area, living out his days in Brownsville, caring for his crippled sister Sally. He died alone in 1835 at the age of 75. Robert Benham would rejoin the fight after his wounds were healed. He took part in several battles between patriots and the Indians before retiring from military life. Eventually, he returned to the sites of his adventures, purchasing property in Cincinnati and northern Kentucky. And in 1792, he operated one of the first ferries between Cincinnati and Newport. He also got involved in politics, becoming one of Campbell County's first justices, and he was on the board at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. His son Joseph became a prominent lawyer in the tri-state and was asked to give a welcoming speech upon the visit of General Lafayette to Cincinnati in 1825. Robert Benham died in Lebanon, Ohio in 1809. The fantastic story of Rogers' defeat and the subsequent story of survival of Robert Benham and Basil Brown swept through the frontier and was told and retold by generations, from Theodore Roosevelt to the yearbooks of the Boy Scouts of America. And today, if you travel to Dayton, Kentucky, you will find a Benham Street, so named by Dayton founder James Berry. It runs north and south and starts near where the old beaches once were, where Robert Benham, Basil Brown, and the entire crew of Captain David Rogers met the foe during our war for independence. And it happened right here in the River Cities. I'm Cam Miller. You can find me on Twitter at Cam Miller Films and on Facebook at facebook.com/CamMillerFilms. Thanks for listening.